Throughout railway history, there's always been an emphasis on preserving locomotives that were the first of their kind. First of a standard design, first to go 100 miles an hour, even the first engine to work in a foreign country. One such engine holds the title of not only being the first locomotive of its kind built in Australia, but also the first ever engine to work in Western Australia too. You'd think then that such a unique specimen would be high on the preservation list, but strangely, it seemed that nobody wanted to keep it. In the 1870s, as the railways of Africa were being expanded, it was found that local wood was very susceptible to termites, making it unusable for railway sleepers, and as a result, imported hardwoods became very desirable. This demand led to a logging boom in Western Australia, which was plentiful with hardwood, and naturally, in order to meet growing demands, more efficient ways of moving the wood were required. The Western Australia Timber Company thus decided to build a 12-mile tramway connecting their mill in Yoggenup to a private jetty at Lockville near Busselton. The line was built to a gauge of 3 foot 6 inches, and the rails were made of wood topped with iron to help with wear and tear. Though the rails were cheap, the Western Australian Timber Company decided to splash out and purchase a brand new locomotive to take loads from the mills to the docks. Rather than import a locomotive from England, as was common for the time, an order was put in with the Victoria Foundry in Ballaarat, which produced a rather tidy little 040 well tank engine, equipped with 3-foot driving wheels, a pair of 7 by 14 inch cylinders, Gooch-link valve gear, was 16 foot 9 inches long and weighed a little over 10 tons. The 040 design wasn't typical for the time, but it's believed the engine may have been based on the tank engines built by Fletcher Jennings in England. Not only was this engine the first locomotive to be built in Ballaarat for domestic use, but it was also the first 3-foot 6-inch gauge locomotive to be built in Australia. It was named Ballaarat by the Mayor of Melbourne in honour of the place it had been built before being disassembled and shipped off to Busselton, scheduled to arrive in July 1871. But harsh weather delayed its arrival, with the tramway having to use horses to run the line while they waited for the engine. At last it arrived in August, and a ceremony was held to celebrate the engine's arrival, with Ballaarat becoming the first ever locomotive to operate in Western Australia. Quite a lot of firsts for one little engine. Ballaarat proved to be quite a popular little workhorse, with locals rather confusingly referring to the Lockville-Yoggenup Railway as the Ballaarat tramline. The engine, however, did require some modifications in order to work more effectively. A tender was built to increase fuel and water storage, with the footplate being shortened by 12 inches to make room for it. A cab was cobbled together and a spark arrestor was fitted to the chimney. It worked well, but despite its seeming popularity, by 1877, both it and the Lockville jetty were in poor condition. The demand for wood began to decrease over the years, leading to financial troubles for the Western Australian Timber Company, and the gold rush in the east that followed led to many workers simply leaving. In 1887, the mills closed, and with no traffic, the Ballaarat tramway stopped running too. The Western Australian Timber Company's assets were auctioned off in 1888, and though there was some interest in Ballaarat, nobody ever bought it. It passed through several hands before ending up in a shed in Lockville where it would remain for a long time. The lack of interest was likely due to Ballaarat's lack of power and poor state of repair. Many early colonial foundries didn't have the resources needed to build powerful or complex engines, which is why so many were imported from the US and Britain. Domestically produced engines at the time it was built tended to be cobbled together out of necessity and usually broke down after heavy use. But that was quickly changing as more locomotive works began to appear, and engines like Ballaarat were being left in the dust. Even with its multiple claims to fame, it simply served no practical use. Then, in 1900, the shed it was stored in caught fire, destroying the engine's cab, wooden boiler lagging, buffer beams, and the frames of the tender. Now damaged beyond use, Ballaarat simply remained where it was, in the middle of a field exposed to the elements. Ballaarat's legacy as the first engine to operate in Western Australia wasn't so quickly forgotten, and in 1901 a letter was sent to the director of the Western Australia Museum and Art Gallery, Mr. Woodward, suggesting the engine be preserved there. There wasn't much interest in preserving the engine at first, but eventually in 1905 Woodward said he'd be willing to preserve the engine if the Western Australian Government Railways was willing to move it to Perth. The WAGR sent a locomotive foreman to assess Ballarat's condition, who essentially wrote it off, saying it was missing its builder's plates, all its woodwork and boiler mountings, the tender was scrap and was overall in bad condition. Despite the metalwork and motion being relatively intact, he followed it up by calling it, quote, a very poor specimen of locomotive construction of its period. Woodward decided it'd be better to leave the engine and preserve locomotives number 1 or 3 belonging to the government railway instead. Discussion of whether the engine was worthy of preservation continued for years, with the Sunday Times in 1919 writing about the state of the engine and the inaction of the museum to save it. It took until 1925 for action to be taken, when the Mayor of Busselton managed to contact the appropriate authorities to get it a place in the Midland Junction workshops. The owner of the land Ballaarat was on was more than happy to give it away for free, and so the only cost involved would have been transporting it. When a locomotive superintendent was sent to inspect the engine, he found that the tender was missing and noted how pricey it would be to move. The tender, as it turned out, had been used for parts and made into a new tender for an engine used by the Adelaide Timber Company, but was eventually scrapped by the 1980s. Despite the price, Ballaarat was taken to the Midland Junction workshops for assessment, but was deemed too expensive to even cosmetically restore, and so was put to one side. It came out of the shed for a short while in 1929, where it appeared at the state's centenary celebrations, but found itself back in storage when plans to put it in the Western Australian Museum fell through. Displaying it at Perth Station also didn't happen, and so in 1937 Ballaarat was sent back to where it came from and put on display at Victoria Square in Busselton, having its funnel shortened and being painted green. Despite being preserved, the engine would remain outdoors and exposed for the next 75 years. A small shelter was eventually constructed over it, but the rust and rain had certainly left their mark. It wasn't until 2012 that efforts began to properly restore the engine, when a team of volunteers backed by a local machining company and a lottery grant took it apart and set about repairing it. The metal components were simply cleaned and repaired, with as few parts being replaced as possible and new wooden boiler cladding being applied. Eventually, Ballaarat was reassembled and given a new home at the former Busselton railway station, which has since been turned into a visitors centre. Thanks to the hard work and devotion of countless enthusiasts, Ballaarat managed to go from a rusting pile of iron to standing as the oldest surviving locomotive built in Australia. Not bad for something considered a poor specimen for its time. Considering its status as a significant point in Australian railway history, it's a surprise that so few people wanted to preserve it. So let Ballaarat be a reminder then of how easily valuable things can be lost through indifference, and that it can be a hard fight to save the things we love. But I'd say all that effort is worth it in the end, don't you? Subscribe for more.